Good evening and welcome to this evening's webinar, the first in a series entitled Empowering Parents. This one is called A Guide to Gender and Identity in Adolescence. And we intend to do a few of these. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Aodha de Brún, and I founded the Countess a year and a half ago. We launched a year ago. And in that time, in the past year, we have gained 10,000 followers across our social platforms. We're on Twitter, Instagram. We've got a community of 1,000 strong on Facebook. We're going live on Facebook at the moment. And we have a website and a YouTube channel. So if you enjoy tonight's offering, please feel free to look at our YouTube channel. It's called The Countess Conversations. So who are we? We are a group of progressive women from all walks of life, including doctors, lawyers, stay-at-home mums, students. We're not affiliated to any ideology or political party or religion, but we are working together to highlight the impact of gender identity theory or gender identity ideology on women and children. And what is gender identity theory or ideology? Well, put simply, it's the idea that one can change sex, that one can be born in the wrong body. Now, we're not here to change anyone's beliefs around gender identity. That's not our place. People obviously can believe what they want and clearly should be allowed to express themselves however they wish, and that should be encouraged. But we are here to simply look at the impact of this ideology or theory in practice and in policy on women and children in particular. And tonight's webinar is nothing to do, it's not about trans-identified adults, because they have had a different journey to the cohort that we are talking about today. For instance, older trans adults didn't go online and type in, I hate my body or am I gay, and find a deluge of information about being trans. Nor did they, was their gender dysphoria something that made them kind of cooler and gave them a cachet in school. So it's very important to differentiate those cohorts. The cohort that we're talking about tonight is vulnerable, they're quite often distressed. And so it behoves us as parents, but also as teachers, and really anyone with the duty of care to young people, to become fully informed and to understand what's happening and to weigh up the evidence. We feel quite strongly that this is a democracy and everyone should be able to inform themselves and then do what's in the best interest for those children. Now, unfortunately, this debate has become very polarized, and even this field of medicine has become quite politicized, and that is just not helpful when it comes to what's in the best interest of children. So our mission tonight is to dial down that heat and to take a step back and remember that we are the adults in the room, and it behoves us to get beyond the rhetoric really and to look at the data and to inform ourselves with information that's legally and clinically sound. So just before I introduce our esteemed guests, I wanted to talk about two other remarkable women who have written books. So if you're interested in this area, you're new to it, you've lots and lots of questions, you don't know where to start, and it is very hard to get good information. There has been a dearth really of sound clinical and medical information in this area. So I would recommend two different books. The first one is Helen Joyce's book. You can see it there, it's disappearing in my green screen. Oh, there we go. It's called Trans. It's by an Irish woman from Bray. She studied in Trinity and then she did a PhD in maths, and she's the Britain editor for The Economist. It's really well researched, really well written. It's absolutely worth a read. The second book is really zooming in on what we're going to discuss tonight. This is called Irreversible Damage. It's by Abigail Schreier. She's an American and she writes for the Wall Street Journal. So another sort of heavyweight look at what's happening, beautifully written as well. And she sort of collates the stories of parents and detransitioners and paints a picture. But without further ado, it's with great pleasure that I introduce our first guest. Stella O'Malley will be very well known to all of you, I'm sure. She's a psychotherapist and a best-selling author of 3 books. Cotton Wool Kids, Bullyproof Kids, and Fragile. And also a real pioneer in this whole area and this debate, because she was the presenter of a 2018 documentary that traveled around Europe talking to detransitioners. And these are the young women who regret the medical interventions that they have undertaken, thinking that they could change their sex. She's also a clinical advisor for SEGM, the Society of Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, and she's the chief facilitator at the Gender Dysphoria Support Network. And that's a therapeutic support group for families who have been impacted by gender dysphoria. And we will give you more details about those groups throughout tonight's chat. We have a team of moderators who will be, dropping all those links to all of that great resources. Stella also runs a podcast called Gender, A Wider Lens with the therapist Sasha Aodha. She's a BA in counselling and psychotherapy and a master's in CBT. And she's currently studying for a PhD in gender issues in children, because you have so much free time, Stella. It's great to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Lovely to be here. Great to get parents together, because I think the strength is with the parents. Yeah,
I totally agree. So we're here to empower parents and also I have to say teachers, because after all, that's where children spend their time. And we hope this might also prove useful or interesting to practitioners and clinicians and anyone really involved in the care of children. So Stella, can you tell me firstly about your childhood, about growing up, your own story and what brought you to this point, and what then made you sit up and pay attention to what was happening in this area of psychotherapy, of medicine, of the culture?
Yeah, sure I can. I was a kind of an unusual kid, because I had a very intense experience with gender from the age as far back as I could go, really. And I wanted to be a boy, and I thought I should be a boy, and I thought I'd be better as a boy. And I know enough about this world to know that I would have very easily been diagnosed with gender dysphoria had I been brought to a clinician at the time. Now, that was growing up in Blanchardstown in Dublin in 70s and 80s, and not a chance was I going to be brought to a doctor. And I do want to point out that any of the stats you read about trans kids, they're very extreme, and I say trans kids in inverted commas, they're very extreme cases, because to be brought to a clinician, you're already in the extremes. And I certainly was very extreme, and I wasn't brought. But it wasn't in the culture at the time, and it served me well. So nobody really took very much notice of me being a boy and acting like a boy, and asserting that I was a boy. Everywhere I went when I was a kid, I'd be asked, are you a boy and a girl? And I'd answer kind of different answers. Sometimes I'd answer no, and I often see myself as the kind of non-binary pioneer.
I was going to say that.
1981 Blanche. And I knew I didn't want to be a girl. And I look back now, because I've learned so much about this, and I think there was a very strong streak of internalized misogyny. I didn't like girls. I didn't think much of girls. I thought they were prissy, and I thought they were annoying. And I didn't want to be anything to do with them, and I wasn't. And like I say, that went on unchecked and unnoticed, and very little attention given to it. And, I was a very unhappy kid for an awful lot of other reasons. And that was just part of my life. I think a manifestation of the unhappiness, I often think. And on it went for many years. Now, if anybody wants to look up what is the criteria for gender dysphoria in children now, you'll see that 6 out of 8 of the criteria are based on stereotypes such as wanting to play with the opposite sex toys, wanting to wear the opposite sex clothes, wanting to play with the opposite sex, and really something out of 1950s. So yeah, I would have easily ticked all 8 of the criteria, quite easily, and you only needed them for 6 months. I had them for at least 7 years, all of the criteria. And then after that, I went into puberty, and I realized it was very much a reckoning for me, because I realized, wow, nature is so much bigger than me. I can want all I want, that my body won't change. I can want to be a boy all I want, but actually my body is changing, and nothing I can do about it. And so that was really shocking to me. And I think I lived in a different era where you were left to it. It was a very horrible time, and it was a very lonely time, and I was desolate and all over the place. But I ultimately realized, and I've heard quite a few trans people from that period say, being trans wasn't an option for me. I'll just make sure my electrics are okay. Being trans wasn't an option for me because it just wasn't in the water, it wasn't in the culture. And I'm very glad it wasn't, because ultimately I had that horrible puberty. It did last some years, but ultimately I pulled out of it. And off I went on my way. I'd say I moved from that weird gender dysphoria. Like I say, back then it would have been called something like gender identity disorder. It had a different name. It was the same kind of criteria, similar anyway. And then I moved on and had my life. I'd say I moved into fairly common or garden body loathing from my gender dysphoria, which an awful lot of teenage girls have. And off I went, I moved into that world quite kind of seamlessly, and had my life. And then I became a psychotherapist in my 30s, and started writing books, especially around parenting and around how difficult it is to be a parent these days. And my first book, Cotton Wool Kids, is very much about the disempowerment of parents, and how so many parents feel that they have to give their power away to the experts because they are not fit to kind of give their children a sufficient upbringing. And I rail against it. I think it's untrue. I think we have to give power to the parents, because I think you have to, that's the whole concept of parenting. You have babies because you want to bestow your values and your learning and your thinking on the kids. And so off I went, wrote a few books, and I noticed that the trans phenomenon was more and more in the media. And every so often I'd say to my husband or my sister, who'd obviously witnessed it all as a kid, I must say something about this gender thing. I had that experience as a kid, and I must add my voice. And every time I did, people would look at me as in, would you really? Like, really? Would you? As in, that's a fairly hot debate, and a pretty mad debate was the general vibe. And then I was just about to release my book on bullying, and I read an article about a person called Cyril Doty and Corey Doty, and they're a family. The parent is non-binary, and the parent fought the Canadian courts for the right to raise their child as you, not F for female, not M for male, but you. And you stood for either unassigned or unknown. And Corey Doty won that case. And this perfectly healthy baby, who did not have any sort of kind of developmental sex disorder, didn't have any differences, didn't have anything what would be, old-fashionedly called intersex, didn't have any difference. This was a healthy baby. There was absolutely no doubt what the biological sex of this child was. But the parent, who's non-binary, won in Canada because the parent, in Canada, they're very, very into this ideology, and they won the right to do it. And so I thought, I got to add my voice to this. So I did add my voice, and I wrote an article for the Sunday Independent. And as a result, I was asked to do a film for Channel 4 called Trans Kids, It's Time to Talk. And the premise of the film was, could any of the 4,000% escalation in children seeking to medically transition, could any of them be like me? Could any of them grow out of it and become perfectly happy in their own body? I ended up having 2 children, who was real earth mother with, breastfeeding and all that sort of stuff. So I'm very, 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 very glad that I didn't medically transition. I was only watching something the other day, and I thought, I was so lucky to be born in the generation I was, because I was left alone to work through it. It was horrible, it was lonely, but I wasn't railroaded down a track. And so, yeah, the premise of the film was, could any of these 4,000% rise in the numbers, could any of them be like me? And we were shut down to an extraordinary degree. And Ollie Lambert, who did the film with me, he's a director, and he's won, Emmys. And for his films, he's done a lot of films in Iraq and Israel, and a lot of war films. And of all the films he's ever done, and he's done over 30, this was the most closed down, where nobody would speak to us. And everybody would say, no, what you're asking is transphobic. And we were saying, no, we're not asking anything transphobic. We're asking, could there be any chance there'd be mistakes? Because here's somebody, Stella, who's a psychotherapist, who had very intense experiences and who's backed up by her family, and nobody, you know what I mean? Like, everybody in Blanche knew that I was like this. And they were like, no, that's transphobic. Because apparently, up until 10 years ago, whatever experience every woman had, well, every woman who had my experience, it's being dismissed categorically, while everything that happened post 2010 is suddenly considered a trans kid, which doesn't make sense. Like, why would it just suddenly erupt as a concept?
And where are the older women transitioning? If this is, something that was just repressed in all of us, and there was always, then it doesn't make sense. In terms of the logic of the narrative, there should be lots of older women transitioning, and they don't exist. But on that point, actually,
in their thousands, they should
be.
They should be in their thousands. If this was something that stays with you forever, people like me, or the equivalent of me, would now be transitioning because they'd be free to. Exactly. Just like when gay people kind of came out, a huge amount of older gay people came out. It wasn't exactly corresponding, but it was significant.
Yes.
It was noticeable.
So with regard to that point, we do often hear, in the culture, my child is trans and it's as natural as being gay, it's as natural as having red hair. And the idea is as well that any dissent from that story, from that narrative, is akin to the moral panic, of America in the 50s and 60s, that to argue with that idea is to be homophobic or transphobic. Can you just explain, in your own mind, the difference between is being trans like being gay or lesbian or bisexual, or is it completely a different thing? I mean, obviously, being gay or lesbian or bisexual is to do with who you want to have sex with. That's what it is fundamentally. But can you just explain, what is this a new sexual orientation? Because that's the way it's often presented to us in the culture.
Yeah, it's presented like that, but it's presented incorrectly, because it's not the same. It's a gender identity. It's a sense of being either a woman, a man, or a non-binary, or a different identity. There is no equivalent to that and who you want to have sex with, who you want to go to bed with. It's a very different concept. And equating these two is really simplistic and incorrect, and it needs to be taken up every single time. It's like there was almost a vacuum once that we kind of welcomed in everybody gay. It's like, what can we do next to be inclusive? And this has kind of landed on our laps. And you can trace back, when the kind of the gay rights liberation movement happened in the 1960s, you can trace back that right from the beginning, there were trans people who were on the outsides of that kind of movement. Why? Because it was the city kind of edgy kind of people in town, in the cities, and they were there. But right from the beginning, lesbians were saying, there's trans women trying to get into the toilets, there's trans women trying to get into our women's spaces. There is a difference in the energy, and there is a difference when there's a group of women together, and then when there's a group of women together with trans women. There is a difference. Why? Because estrogen and testosterone are phenomenally different hormones. And when they kick in, so up until 10, honestly, what's the difference? It's not massive. Do you follow me? There is a bit of testosterone as a kid, but once you hit 10 onwards, you're getting a huge amount of changes in your body, and you're driven in different ways, whether it's testosterone or estrogen. But being gay, and to equate that with gender identity, is ridiculous. I do want to point out this concept of gender identity, that it's within you. It's a new concept, and most people would argue you're born in the body you're born with. There is no other option. And when you're born in that body, it has pros and cons. It has either testosterone or estrogen driving through you. And so you might want to be a boy, or you might want to be a girl. However, you were kind of saddled with the body you have. And if you want to medically transition, that everybody's free to do whatever they want in this world. But as a safeguarding issue for children, you'd have to be very careful, because you are going to change. If you support a child to transition, you are making decisions on their sex life for the rest of their life. And they will have impaired sexual functioning. They will have, if they're girls, certainly pain on orgasm, to the point of it's not worth orgasming because it's too painful. They will have a lot of difficulties, such as vaginal infections. And then the boys will have their own issues, and it's equivalent, but it's different. And not only that, more than anything, you'll have a very heavy medical burden for the rest of your life. And it will impair, like, you know, as often said, it's putting diesel into the petrol tank. You're continuously putting an opposite sex hormone into your body. And that's the big difference. There is no equivalent in being gay. If I said I'm gay today, that's fine. There's no medical imposition happening. And what happens more than anything is infertility. So if a 12-year-old is, you know, supported to transition, and if a 12-year-old is given puberty blockers, they're set on a road that will one day change their sex life, impair their ability to orgasm, and impair their ability to have children. And I would argue they have no concept of that. And the parent has no, should not have the authority to change their child's sex life and their child's fertility. So I feel very, very strongly that this is an adult decision. There's certain decisions you have to make in life, and I would say this is one of them that's adult.
And quite often we hear, you know, and people watching, you know, quite often a child will come home from school and they'll say, so and so has changed their name and they're now a boy and they want he, him pronouns. And this is what we call social transition. It's when the adults surrounding this child agree that, you know, they should sort of go through life with changing their hair, changing their clothes, and adopting the opposite sex name. But, you know, it's called living as the opposite sex. But people, I think, see social transition as the soft option or the harm-free option. You know, I think there is growing awareness of the burden of medical transition, but social transition is seen as a way to keep that child happy and to alleviate their distress without the risk of medical transition. Can you discuss that a bit? What are your views on that?
Well, my views is it's a very powerful psychotherapeutic intervention, and the research so far shows that it solidifies and concretizes the child's identity, and it makes them much more likely to want to transition, much more likely to transition medically. And in a way, identity formation, anybody who knows anything about psychology would know between 12 and 25, you're undergoing identity formation. That's what we're doing. That's why many of us became cure heads and we became punks and we became whatever. It was right and proper and appropriate. And then in and around about the age of 25, an awful lot of things are calming down in your brain. And you solidify as yourself, and off you go into your kind of adult life. If you make a very strong kind of intervention into a child's identity within the mass of that formation, you're shaping the child in a big way. So to think that you can kind of blithely and casually carry out a therapeutic intervention, which is called social transition, without clinical supervision, without thought, without forethought, and without monitoring it and without supervising it, is incredibly foolhardy. And I want to caution any teachers who are here. I want to say there is no research. You do not know what is going to happen to these kids in 5 or 10 years. Yeah, it might be fine. Right now, there's only a few papers. Ken Zucker has a paper in 2019 where it suggested that they're much more likely to medically transition if they undergo social transition. I do say this with the caveat there isn't much research, so we don't know very much. But I do know solidifying identities on any kid between that age. Why would you concretize something? Why not let it, just keep it flexible and keep it kind of loose? And just because the child wants it rigid and the child is protecting it, children like a lot of things. They can declare a lot of things, you know what I mean? A lot of children would have declared that they were a communist to the death when they were 15. And you change, and they're right to. And our job as the adults in the room is to put in the boundaries and say, that's fine, yeah, okay, but you can't make irreversible decisions.
And I would add to that, I would add to your warning there that, you know, with regard to the duty of care, the teachers have to safeguard children individually in their care. We're aware of resources aimed at teachers that tell them explicitly not to tell parents if the child doesn't feel supported at home, and to go ahead with the social transition, in the classroom, but without the parents' consent or without consulting them. And that, of course, is a huge breach of all safeguarding norms, and probably as well, it's contrary to the rights of parents in Ireland, which are very robust. They're enshrined in Bunreacht, and they're codified in the Education Act 1998. Teachers and schools are not allowed and should not take these measures without letting parents know and getting parents' consent. So I think that's really important to make teachers aware of that it's not a kind of soft option, that there are consequences. Tell us please about your work with detransitioners. These are most often young women who, as you said quite eloquently, this is a time of identity formation, and we concretize by the time we're 25. So by that stage, often these women have realized that they weren't actually trapped inside the wrong body after all, and many of them turned out to be lesbians who had internalized lesbophobia or misogyny. Can you explain your work with them and the various bodies that you've set up and that you're part of to help those women and those families?
Yeah, I will. I just want to pause for a second just to talk about the schools in case there are teachers here. Every school in Ireland is entitled to fall in with the ethos of the school. So the ethos of the school is protected within the guidelines in Ireland. And therefore every school has a certain freedom, and they need to protect that freedom, but they are entitled to kind of safeguard the children according to their values. And the second point I want to make, because it's just so incredibly important, as you said, it's against all the norms to come in against parents and children. You could have the most dysfunctional parent in the world. They could be really, really kind of deeply in addiction or deeply in dysfunction, and you would not split the parent and the child. You wouldn't have secrets. And there's this kind of myth that there's this kind of extraordinary kind of overwrought transphobia going on, and so you have to keep secrets from the parents. It's not true. These are generally engaged parents who are just trying to go slowly. And most parents, the vast majority of parents, love and know their children a hell of a lot more than anybody else. And to come in on that bond is so foolhardy and so irresponsible. And if I was to write a book about this, I think one chapter would be given over to misinformed, well-meaning adults who presume they know better than parents who've been watching this child since the moment the child took a breath, and who love this child so much more than these misinformed, well-meaning adults. But to go on, yeah, I do. I am in a few organizations. I'm in the IATDD, which is the International Association for Therapists for Detransitioners and Desisters. And we work with detransitioners a lot, and their stories are harrowing. Generally, their age group is about 23, 24, 25. So it takes a few years for somebody to come out of it, which is exactly what anybody knows about psychology and identity formation. Yes, that would be about right. That you're starting to calm down, you're starting to kind of leave behind a lot of the kind of extremities of your positions, and you're hitting the brick wall of reality. But the stories are harrowing. There's an awful lot of mastectomies, an awful lot of shame around their bodies, a lot of infertility, an awful lot of hair growth and balding and vaginal infection. So it's a really difficult road to be a detransitioner. And so if at all possible, it would be better, and we talked about social transition. I would much rather social transition and desistance rather than medical transition and detransition, because it's so difficult, the medical route. And that's where I would really fixate upon, that the medical route is so difficult, if at all possible. If you need a social transition, even though I'd caution about it, it's a hell of a lot better than the medical transition. I'm also director of GenSpect, which is an international group of parents from all over the world. And these are thousands of parents who have all come together as an alliance between parents and professionals to lift the voices of parents, because so many parents are all saying the same thing. Now, we've got kind of something like 15 organizations from 13 countries around the world in GenSpect. And they are all saying that they're worried about the quality of the medical care their children, their gender distressed children, are receiving. When thousands of parents are all saying the same thing, it's time for the world to sit up and listen, because that's not appropriate.
And can you tell us about the therapeutic approach? So maybe if you could just sketch out the affirmative model versus the therapeutic approach, because what you said there was, these parents are engaged, they want the best for their children and the young people, but they just want to take it slowly. They're trying to, hold back. And the child is obviously fixated and completely ideating this idea of themselves as someone of the opposite sex and trying to cast off the part of themselves that they no longer, that they...
More than anything, these children, there's nothing more alluring when you're full of kind of discomfort and your body's changing and you feel weird and you feel you're not, you don't look the way other people look, and everything's wrong with your body and everything's wrong with you. There's nothing more alluring than to be told there's a pill you can take, there's medication you can take, and you can be a completely different person. And you can actually negate that whole uncomfortable, humiliating, embarrassing you. Yeah, they're all gone. That's dead naming. That person is gone. That identity is wiped out. You can be somebody new. And you know who they're thinking of? Why? Because they're young, idealistic kids. They're thinking, I'm going to be like that cool looking YouTube guy that I'm looking at day in, day out. And these YouTube sensations, they're making money and they are very juvenile, frankly. Even when they're 26, 27, they're generally trans men. These trans men, they act like they're 17 and they're all like, hi guys, here I am. And these, teenage girls are like, I want to be like him. And he's so nice. And it's just like when I was a kid, they all liked the boy bands. And the boy bands were like these kind of dorky little kind of nerdy boys. And so, you know what I mean? Very kind of...
And asexual. Boy bands were always quite
very asexual.
Yeah. Interesting. So these young trans men who are influenced
are asexual.
More. So it's fascinating.
And they are asexual very often because sex has become a very difficult part of many, many trans men's life. Not all, but a huge amount, because testosterone is very, very harsh on the body. And so there's nothing more alluring for those kids who are generally lost, generally kind of looking for an identity, and they find a community. And they're often told that they're very brave and stunning to come out as trans. And yet again and again, they're being lauded, they're being applauded, they're being absolutely welcomed and supported. So this kind of myth that it's brave, it isn't quite true. It's actually very, very, very warm for them to say that they're trans, and they're getting a lot of support. And so we have to be very careful. I forget what your question was, though. I've rambled on.
Oh, I was asking you about if you could just explain as...
Oh, the therapeutic approach. This is really important. Yeah.
And therapeutic model.
So many people think, oh, but there's no other option for gender dysphoria. The only thing you can do is medicalize. And I can't emphasize just how rubbish that is. Basically, there's a million different conditions in the world of manifesting unhappiness. You can manifest unhappiness with anorexia. You can manifest unhappiness with addiction. You can manifest unhappiness with gender dysphoria. There's many ways to manifest it. And then what generally happens is you fixate on your solution. And your solution might be losing weight, or it might be becoming a different person, or it might be washing your hands to keep a feeling of control in the world. And you fixate on that as a way of calming yourself down. And that's what we do, and psychologically it's what we've done all our life for thousands of generations. And suddenly, out of nowhere, one condition, which is called gender dysphoria, has been plucked out and said, oh, this one is different. This one needs medicalization. Every other one, you can do talk therapy with all the rest, but you can't do it with this one because this one is special. And there's no basis for that. Common or garden psychotherapy works very, very well with gender dysphoria. It's a slow process, just like it would be with an eating disorder, where you're basically trying to build a sense of kind of self-love in the person, a sense of compassion, a sense of acceptance, a sense of softness towards themselves, and a kind of expanding their life so that they're not fixated on the one rigid solution. And so many different types of psychotherapy. It could be, psychoanalysis. It could be Jungian. It could be, there's various, Karen Rogers, there's loads of different ways. But to say that there's one condition that just you've got to immediately get a surgeon involved is just absolutely, and by the way, not backed up with the research. The research shows very clearly that medical transition doesn't up the happiness. It doesn't create a huge amount of happy people. Gender dysphoria is a very difficult condition. And if you have it pre-transition, or you can have it post-transition, your unhappiness maintains. Mm. And so the most famous kind of long-term study of people who've transitioned is a 40-year study from Sweden. And it showed that people who had post-medical transition were 19.1 times more likely to die by suicide. And so you're saying, even after transitioning, they're much more likely to die by suicide. Why? Because it's a very difficult condition. So you could say the same for lots of different things. And earlier on, you made an equation with some people think gender dysphoria is kind of similar to being gay. If you wanted to know what it's similar to in a psychological level, you'd look at anorexia and you'd say before the 1970s, there wasn't any anorexia, very little, the odd, in the books, but very little. Then there was bulimia, very little in the books, and then it arrived. Then there was self-harming, very little in the books, and then it arrived. And what's the common denominator? Teenage girls is the common denominator here, very strongly. And now where are we going? We're up to 2020 and we've got gender dysphoria and we've got teenage girls. It's incredibly similar kind of fixation, very kind of, these are generally kind of competent, competitive, intense kids who are often not madly popular socially, a little bit socially awkward, very intelligent. That's a straight line. So there's a lot more similarities with that than there is with being gay, which is frankly anybody from the population. There's no kind of personality type.
You've alluded there to what sort of personality. Can you talk of that a little bit more? And also, what should parents look out for? Is there correlation between a lot of time spent online? What should parents be alert to? What signs are there before the parent is blindsided by the child having, done all the research and they have a very entrenched position? What can parents see in that timeline, perhaps? What could they look out for?
I do kind of parent groups in the GDSN, and I know there's some people from the GDSN here tonight, and they're missing their parent group. So thank you very much for the support, which is very nice of them. But in the parent groups in the GDSN, that's the Gender Dysphoria Support Network, you see again and again and again a certain type of kid, and again there's been a heavy use of tech, a huge amount of tech, and there's been a trauma. They're the two very, very common denominators there. So there's been some sort of trauma, maybe they've been cast out of the friendship group and they went online. They went into the bedroom, they went online. I hate myself. Things like that was keyed into Google. I hate my body, I hate myself, I hate everything about me, something like that. And they've ended up with, well, maybe you're trans, because that's where it goes if you kind of Google that. And you should do that experiment yourself, and you'll see where you end up. And so the very often they say the heavy tech use is what parents should watch out for. If you want to move beyond gender with your child, try to expand them beyond their tech use. And I have to say, there's a great book called iGen. I can't think of her name, but it's a brilliant book. I'll look it up and I'll put it in the chat later. And, she showed how that there's an awful lot of, this whole generation of children, they're physically curtailed, so they don't have half as much freedom as they used to have. And they're online, they're in their bedrooms online. Jean Twenge is the author. Yes, thank you very much. Brilliant writer, Jean Twenge. And she talks about iGen, like iGeneration. And this is a real issue. These iGeneration, they kind of think that their bodies are kind of immaterial, almost like a digital person, that you can put a little bit of testosterone in and you can change yourself like this. And they're all almost like
an avatar, actually, like an avatar.
Yes.
Yeah.
They have a digital mindset to themselves because they've been online so much. So when it first happened and all the columnists were wringing their hands, what's going to happen with all these children who are online all the time? Well, this is going to happen. They have a very disconnected relationship with their body. They're very disconnected with nature. They just see their body as basically like their clothes, that they can change as they wish. And it's actually, nature is very, very big in our lives. And when you start studying estrogen and testosterone, that's another book, by the way, if anybody wants to read. Couldn't recommend it more. Carol Hooven and Testosterone. If you have a child who's, especially a girl who's identifying as trans, you read Testosterone and you'll sit back on, wow, that is one strong hormone. And you can start teaching the child about testosterone, how much it's impacting when you take testosterone. It's phenomenal. So is estrogen, but it's in a very different kind of way.
Stella, can you drop that into the chat, or?
Yeah, I will.
That would be great, because we're just trying to keep that going with all the resources, and people will be going, what did you say? I can't find, what was the name? How do you spell it? Stella, thank you. We could talk all night, but we need to leave it there for now. But we will be coming back to you for the live Q&A.
Perfect.
So see you then. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, our next guest tonight is a consultant physician based in Galway. She specialises in internal medicine and nephrology for adults and for older teenagers, and she teaches at the Royal College of Surgeons and at NUIG. Her practice requires her to assess the quality of evidence for use of medication in multiple different conditions, often in combination, and taking into account both short-term and long-term impacts in individual patients. She works closely with colleagues in many other fields, including gynecology, urology, and surgical specialities. I'm proud to call her a friend, and it was with great pleasure that I introduced Dr. Annette Neary to the webinar. Good evening, Annette.
Hi, Alicia.
How are you?
Feeling spiritual.
Well, it's great that we finally get to do this, and it's a real honour to sit down and chat to you about this whole area. First off, can you just talk us through your childhood and your background and your route to medicine? Did you have a calling? And also, what then made you sit up and pay attention to what was happening in this particular field of medicine?
Well, listening to Stella is very interesting from my point of view, because so many of her experiences, I would have had a similar history, but I was very fortunate in that I had a very matriarchal upbringing. My grandmother, my mother's mother, had said to the girls in Mayo in 1930, my daughters need an education, the boys will be fine. She couldn't afford to educate all of them, but the girls needed education. And I think she recognised the bleakness for a woman in that era who did not have that background. But my mother had to give up work when she got married. As you probably gathered, I wasn't brought up in Ireland, but my late parents were from, Mum was from Aodha, Dad was from Donegal, and I was brought up in Birmingham. So I have a slightly different perspective as well, because obviously I was brought up in a much more secular society. But Mum had to give up work as well when she got married. It wasn't just in Ireland that was an issue. In terms of how I got into medicine, it was, I think like a lot of young people in that era, especially if my parents were devout Catholic. There was a sense of vocation, that you would have a vocation. And I think it's, at the time, I remember realising that obviously I couldn't be a priest because I was female, and I didn't want to be a nun. And I was bright. I knew I was bright. I was the youngest of three, but my elder sister was already a few years ahead of me and doing very well academically. And apparently at the age of 7, I said to the family, I want to be a doctor. Now, I'm not from a medical family. My dad was a landscape gardener, had to leave school at 14. He was the eldest of the family. So he'd had to leave for England or Britain for work, just like Mum had to do. So it was very much feeling that there was a purpose that I was there to fulfill. But it was interesting listening to Stella speaking, because I didn't like dolls. I love soccer. I wanted a Meccano. I wanted to have a train set. I used to play soccer with the boys in the playground when I was at the primary school. Wasn't particularly into clothes. I had weight issues because probably, again, sort of, there's lots of stresses that you have as kids, because every family is different. And my dad was type 1 diabetic. My middle sister had a genetic condition, and so money was tight. So I think there were all these pressures as well. So I think I probably would have what would be called body dysmorphia now. But one of the advantages I had was that my parents didn't bat an eyelid when I said I liked the things that were traditionally regarded as more male. And I was also at a time when feminism was really coming to the fore, certainly in the early 70s in England, Britain generally. An awful lot of the Equal Pay Act came in 1975. My sister was involved in Reclaim the Night walks when there was when a lot of problems with women just not being able to go out of the door, and obviously this Yorkshire Ripper case was going on. So it was a very different environment for me growing up in England then. But that's really how my feminism developed, because I learned it at my mother's knee and also with my big sister. And I realised that medicine was male dominated, and I just felt very strongly that there was a place for me there, and that's how I ended up doing medicine.
And when did you first sit up and pay attention and say, realize that something, this was a different type of field that, you've talked in the past about evidence-based medicine. So in what way does that, so can you explain actually what the affirmative approach is and what that would look like in your everyday work as a clinician?
Yeah, I think the main thing really is it's the diagnostic issue. I mean, one of the things that I do as a nephrologist and a general physician is my big thing is making a diagnosis. So sometimes very straightforward. Somebody comes in and they've got obvious symptoms of a bad asthma attack, or they've had a stroke. But I see a lot of patients coming through who just have very non-specific symptoms, and you then have to go sort of chasing it down and try and work out what's going on. But the diagnosis is key, and you have to make a correct diagnosis, because if you don't, you will put patients on the wrong treatment. You potentially will, by doing that, you'll sabotage future treatment as well if you get it wrong. So one of the problems every doctor has is, and we joke about it, half joking, wholly serious, about Dr. Google, because people look up their symptoms and they decide themselves what's wrong with them, and thinking, the thing is, what will happen is people always latch on to something that they think is causing the trouble because it sounds a bit like what they have. And as a doctor, you have to be objective. So we were advised by the medical council never to look after our own families, because you have to be objective. And having trained as a kidney specialist, I actually moved out of that field because my late sister went on to dialysis and died subsequently after a transplant. And you're just not objective anymore. So emotion gets in the way. So that can seem very cold, I think, for a lot of people. It doesn't mean to say that we are cold. We actually care a lot about what happens to the patients that are under our care. But the big thing about medicine, and has been there for a couple of millennia, is above all do no harm. And you have to make the right diagnosis before you can make a treatment plan, and listening to everything. I was nodding away listening to everything Stella said, because the last thing you want to do is put people on medication unless you've got a clear diagnosis. And I was just checking the literature again today before I came on. I mean, somebody was looking at some scoring systems to see if we could actually score adolescents as to whether or not they would end up with they would end up being genuinely trans, and the data just isn't there. And I mean, I fell into this really as a feminist, because I was beginning to get worried about what was happening with women's rights and the whole thing with bathroom laws, that sort of thing. And then it was only when I started looking at the medical literature and realizing the massive gaps in evidence that it really started to worry me.
And so clearly this has become politicized, and it is quite sensitive and fractious at times debate. But we often hear that it's very similar. Trans healthcare is similar to the demand and the fight for AIDS medication back during the AIDS pandemic. And you actually have worked in HIV medicine and attended AIDS conferences.
Yes.
And worked closely with HIV patients in the 80s. In your view, and through that specific experience that you have firsthand of that era, and also as a clinician, what is your view? Is it similar? I mean, on one hand, it might seem quite similar because there's a kind of an activist-led movement for more access
Yes.
to particular drugs, etc. However, what are the differences? And also always being mindful that what we're discussing tonight is specifically the younger cohort, of course.
Yes.
But can you just explain, firstly, tell us a bit about that work that you did and the AIDS conferences you went to, and what was similar and what was different? Is that comparison, does that hold, is it a fair comparison?
I think one of the things that shocked me about the dearth of evidence in trans healthcare was that obviously, this includes trans adults, is how trans adults have existed for a number of decades. And when I was a middle grade doctor, one of the consultants I worked alongside in urology actually was doing gender reassignment surgery. So, it was something I was very aware of and very empathic about. So it was a bit of a shock sort of 2 or 3 decades later to discover how there is such little evidence, even for trans adults, although trans children. When it comes to, it was obviously in the 80s, AIDS was the new disease. The issue with it, I was very fortunate to be able to go to work in an AIDS unit in San Francisco General. And of course, predominantly it was the gay men affected. And a lot of the staff were gay as well, or lesbian, a lot of women. And we were very lucky. When I was working there, AZT had just become available the year before. So we actually finally had a drug, but that was sort of 6 years after the first cases. When I went to conference a couple of years later, funny enough, in San Francisco, one of the things that was really striking was how emotional people were, how angry sometimes as well. There was a real feeling of a lack of understanding, or certainly a sort of little bit of a sort of people running on parallel lines. You had the medical staff or the healthcare professionals wanting to get the evidence to show good, to prove that we had good drugs, and then on the other hand, you had patients, their loved ones, desperate for drugs. And of course, there's doctors, you feel desperate as well. I think anybody who's watched, the last year and a half, I think, been very educational probably for people, because it's like a ramped up version of what happened with HIV. It's happening with COVID. People are desperate for drugs, desperate for care. So the person, again, bringing up COVID, is that a lot of people will have heard of now, Anthony Fauci. I knew about him back in the 80s because he was obviously very important in developing the whole strategy of managing AIDS. And he went and met the activists. One of the things about HIV medicine, the reasons that it's now, AIDS is now much more of a chronic, HIV illness is more of a chronic condition, is because the huge amount of work in raising funds to investigate it, which was a lot to do with the gay community. And it was really only when I went to start looking at the trans side of things, I realised that it was just a desert in comparison, and that was a bit of a shock, because I think that's where, especially when I started to realise the drugs that were being used in children and adolescents, where there was no data, that's when I really started to get anxious, I think, about the trans side, just beyond the feminism.
And is it also true that the drugs being used as puberty blockers aren't, weren't trialed and tested for that purpose? Can you explain a bit about that?
Yeah.
How they work, what they do, what they're normally intended for, and also, sorry, it's a double-headed question, but can you speak as a doctor what happens in puberty, and if it is really possible to pause it?
That's exactly the thing. I think so many things. I think in terms of just to start with the second question first, is there's a lot of drugs, and I think, and again, if you look at COVID, hydroxychloroquine, now you've got ivermectin, people saying, oh, this is going to work, this is a cure-all. And in theory, there may be theoretical reasons why they're going to work, but in practice, that hasn't proved to be the case. Now, I've seen that a lot in medications, because there have been lots of drugs over the years that have been sold as, in theory, being great. So, I mean, in my own field, there was a drug that was routinely used in intensive care for kidney failure, and there was a lot of doubt amongst the nephrologists as opposed to the intensivists as to whether or not this was a good idea. And we finally got a couple of really good studies which showed actually it was killing more patients than it was helping. So in theory, I've seen a lot of things that in theory are either good or bad, but you have to do the studies. So the issues with puberty is that, I mean, puberty is, Stella has gone through that in a lot of detail already, really. I mean, but in terms of the medical issues, that's when the growth spurt is, that's when a lot of bone development is, that's when obviously a lot of sexual function, but it's much more than just the obvious. I think there's a lot of work, as Stella was saying too, about the fact that it's really, we're not cooked until we're about 25. And there's a neuroscientist based at UC, Sophie Scott, who's done a lot of work on this, looked at a lot of the data, and shown that really, it's really only at that sort of in our early 20s that we really begin to solidify and we become mature cognitively. And I think when you think about how we process information as a child or as an adolescent compared with how we process it when we're more senior, when we're older, I think you can see that. So I think there's the worry, I think, is that people are saying, oh, you can just pause puberty. Well, can you? We don't actually know that you can. We certainly know that there are consequences of putting people on these drugs. I mean, then they would never, what we have in medicine, as a lot of people probably know, is you've got what's called licensed indications. So every drug that is available and in a formulary will have gone through a process and have a license for particular conditions. And the GnRH agonists, which is what these drugs are, they're licensed for two major fields. One is for prostate cancer and other types of cancer where you want to sort of block the gonadotrophins, so certain female cancers as well, but prostate cancer is the big one. And then they're licensed in young children, so under the age of 10, so children who start to develop puberty way too soon. So that's a bad thing if a 6-year-old suddenly starts developing puberty, because they're going to have problems with, obviously, girls going to start having their periods early, and also bone starts to fix earlier too, so they lose height. So those are the indications. What is GnRH agonists are used off license in trans people who are adults, and that's been happening for some decades. Again, there hasn't really been any sort of systematic research that I could find to look at it. There's a big difference between using those drugs when they're regularly used in adults. We know the side effects, we know osteoporosis in cancer patients. But then The situation then with children is completely different, and the data is really quite low. So things like even the Tavistock study, which had to be dragged out of them, showed that increased risks of osteoporosis, and it didn't seem to help, as Stella said, it didn't seem to help the dysphoria. And which is not surprising, really, because as Stella was saying, the problem is that we're back to the diagnostic criteria. Just because somebody is distressed doesn't necessarily mean that what is wrong with them is actually causing that. And I think the other thing I would worry about is that things are going to get missed. So other types of psychological problem may get buried under, and somebody being plamoursed with a label of trans when actually they have a more typical psychiatric issue which is not being treated.
So within that context, how does informed consent work? So the Curabell decision in the first instance has been overturned in the Court of Appeal recently. However, it was on a point of law, not a finding of fact, and there was a word of warning very much in that judgment, saying clinicians need to be aware of their liability if they don't ensure there is fully informed consent from both the patients and the parents as to the long-term effects of the drugs, and it's an evolving field. But how is that possible if, as you said, there is no long-term studies and the data is poor? And in the first court of the first instance, the judge said, it was basically classified as experimental, and it would appear that the NHS have taken that on board and paused all new referrals. You need to get a court order, a best interest court order, if you want to refer an under 16-year-old for puberty blockers. And obviously we don't have a service in Ireland, so therefore those clinicians no longer come here to treat under 16-year-olds for now. But how, within that context, how can a parent and a child give informed consent? And how does informed consent work normally? As a doctor, can you just explain it as a concept?
Sure. I mean, informed consent is just fundamental to every action a doctor should take with every patient. And sometimes it's very simple. You've got somebody you've got pneumonia. They need if you don't give them an antibiotic, they're going to die or get very sick with it. The risk of the antibiotic is very low usually compared with the benefit. So you're weighing up the risk versus the benefit, because there is no such thing as 100% safe drug, just isn't. The thing about informed consent, the recommendations from the indemnity, the insurers that we have for medical malpractice, is that anything over 1% risk, we should be explicit with patients about that risk. It's vital then for something in my field, which is hypertension particularly. I'm going to be putting people on drugs that they will be on for decades potentially. If you're 45 and you've got high blood pressure, and you're going to be on those drugs maybe for 40 years. Now you're hoping that the risk of the problem from the medication is very low, but it needs to be, because they have no symptoms, and the whole point is to prevent them running into trouble. So you have to make sure that you're explaining to the patient why you're giving the drug and what to look out for in terms of side effects or any risks that they might have. Now, my field is full of evidence going back 50 years. So there are calculators to say what the risks are with a certain level of blood pressure as to whether or not, what your risk is. So for every 5 millimeters of rise in blood pressure, you double your risk of having a stroke. So it's quite a small, it sounds like a small amount, it is a small amount, only 5 millimeters. So the problem with the puberty blockers is where's the data? We just don't know. We don't know what the risk of osteoporosis is. It seems to be quite significant, but I can't tell a patient and their families what the risk is, because where's the data? I mean, there is evidence that if you put on a lot of these drugs, I mean, testosterone that Stella mentioned earlier, that increases the blood pressure by 9 millimeters. So that's a huge jump in your blood pressure from somebody. So even if you put a girl or a young woman on testosterone, you significantly raise their blood pressure. And we know that that's not a good thing to have a higher blood pressure, and that will store up trouble for ages. So there's lots and lots of things where I can say, well, this is what it does in theory. This is what some of the effects are from basic research, or just looking into the effects from a physiological point of view. But I can't tell anybody what the risks are in 5 years' time, or 10 years' time, or 20 years' time of what other trouble they're going to run into. And there's a drug that is commonly used. I mean, most people have heard of or know somebody who's on Nexium or Zoton, these very good anti-ulcer drugs. And until about 5 to 8 years ago, we would have been very happy because of very safe drugs, but we now know they increase the risk of chronic kidney disease. But it took over 20 years for us to discover that information. So medicine evolves, things change, drugs that we would use readily, we don't anymore. Drugs that we would have been worried about, we now use more because the evidence evolves. But it's the evidence you need, and nobody should be putting anybody on a drug without actually knowing what the long-term effects are. And we just don't know with these drugs.
And beyond the dearth of good trials and data in general, is there also a big issue here that this whole field has been hugely politicized? But you know, if we look at the history of medicine, it's not the first time this has happened. There have been other diagnostic crazes and treatments that we now look back with horror at.
Yeah.
Were seen to be hugely progressive, cutting edge, and compassionate even. I mean, there's loads of examples. Eugenics in America, for instance, the 50s and 60s was really popular and was seen as a progressive thing to do, progressive treatment. Would you like to expand on that as a doctor? You know, I think it's so important to take a step back from this and look at it in the round. Does it feel like it's happened before?
I think the history, when you look at, I mean, there's so many catastrophes in medicine, and I think you can date it right back into the 19th century, where the way women were and girls were put in asylums because they weren't conforming, and then you've got things like obviously thalidomide is a classic one, but you've got things where lobotomy. I mean, that was something, again, in theory that would work. More recently, we've got vaginal mesh, you've got the issue of symphysiotomies. I mean, I looked after a lady who was one of the people who was affected by having had a symphysiotomy. I mean, her life's been awful ever since then. And so, you know, it's one of the things about medicine is it's actually much harder not to do something as a doctor than it is to do something, because if you're seen to be doing something, then that's and there's a placebo effect, this huge placebo effect of doing something. We know that. It's much harder to know when not to do something, and I think that's what I would be saying to people, is that it comes back to the thing of you don't want to cause irreversible damage to somebody and who is going to have to live with that potentially for 50, 60 years. So in osteoporosis doesn't sound like much, but actually you do not want to get that you don't want to get it at all if you can avoid it. But you certainly don't want to get it in your 20s because you were put on drugs abruptly because in theory they were going to help. And then I think Stella obviously went through the issue about fertility. I mean, there's basically, above all, do no harm is still what should govern one's actions, because it is just that the sometimes what watchful waiting is actually all that's needed, and I do that a lot in my field. You might be surprised that somebody with a kidney disease would suddenly do nothing, because often the immediate thing is, oh, they need dialysis. Well, actually don't really want to put them dialysis because there are all these other issues.
You're actually breaking up there. Can you?
Don't need dialysis at the moment. We'll just have to wait and see and watch. And often things will recover by themselves. So it's something that even goes into that sort of acute, very silly, that I'm worried about the language. Oh, sorry.
We've lost Annette. Annette, if you can just
I think I'm sorry about that. It shouldn't be a.
If you have a look at your Wi-Fi, and I'm just going to open these questions now to the panel, and we've got lots and lots of questions actually, which is great. And if you join us in a moment when you've had a look at your connection. Stella's back. Hi, Stella. We have lots and lots of questions. I'm just going to plow into them actually. So the first one is, I'm just going to ask you to unmute. There we go. So the first one is, people want to know, a few people have asked us, if they want to get help for their child who is in distress, in psychological distress, where should they go if they don't want the child affirmed and they live in Ireland? Is there a way forward along that path, and the child does need some help, some therapy? What steps should they take?
I think the most efficient and appropriate route a parent should take is to contact the Gender Dysphoria Support Network, the GDSN, genderdysphoria-supportnetwork.com. From there, you'll be invited to meetings and you'll meet other parents. But not only that, you'll be provided with all sorts of resources, and you'll be provided with there's loads of different parents groups all over the world. There's Bayswater, there's Our Duty over in UK, and there's so many of them. Parents have already, Gender Dysphoria Support Network, the support in the middle of that line. But yeah, from there, because honestly, I've seen so many children who go to a therapist who doesn't really understand the massive connection with tech and gender, and so that the therapist doesn't really, they've got one arm tied behind their back. They think it's all about the gender when they don't realize this is massively socially mediated on tech. So it's quite important. What you're trying to do as a parent, I think bad therapy is worse than no therapy. And as a parent, empower yourself, put yourself into the center of this, and make sure that you're helping to expand the child's world. When a child is in deep distress, they have a narrow vision of what's the solution. And your job as the parent to expand that vision. So it's a much more, go to GenSpect as well. GenSpect will kind of introduce you to all the parents. I was just thinking Irish parents, I suppose. But yeah, go to GenSpect and you'll kind of find everything. So
this is, this could be a good one for you, Annette. Annette, can you hear us? I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yeah.
It was tragic. We missed you at the start there, at the end there, Annette, because it was fascinating.
So, Annette, how do parents educate siblings about gender ideology and the harms of medical transition? I'm asking as two physician parents with a 14-year-old ROGD girl with 12, 15, 16-year-old sisters who 100% affirm her. Now, this is quite tricky. This is a kind of intra-family dynamics. They're kind, thoughtful, scientifically minded girls, but they've been programmed by society, by school, and by other adult authority figures. As they're constantly correcting our pronouns, I know that any discussion would fall on deaf ears. That is quite a tragic story. So the siblings are affirming the parents.
I think
with specifically how to educate that child on the harms of gender.
I do. God,
Oh, hopefully we haven't lost Annette.
I think my internet's playing up again, unfortunately. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Do you want to try it without video, Annette?
Just try again. I seem to have gone again.
We can hear you though.
I'll try changing.
Server, maybe.
No, I've just changed onto a different one, so that's it better.
Okay, yeah.
Have you got me now?
Yeah.
I
Oh no, it's actually freezing again. Maybe Annette, if you could plug in. Stella, would you like to answer that question? It's a very complex family dynamic that the siblings are affirming their sister.
It's very complex, but I can't wait for Annette to come in and interrupt me when you do. But it's very complex, but it's actually very common.
Yeah.
And it's I find again and again and again, the parents might have one position and the siblings have another, and it can be very divisive. It can cause an awful lot of trouble in the family. Very often the children are viewing it as gay. They don't really have a deeper understanding, and they're just like, why have the parents got an issue? Like they're cool about gay people and they're not cool about trans people. I don't understand that. And they don't realize, well, there is a difference. There's a heavy medical burden. But when you talk about medical burdens and osteoporosis and blood pressure to a teenager, they can't even hear you. So in a way, it's something that I think parents should be very, very cautious about, and talk about kind of distress and unhappiness and being rigid and being fixated on solutions. Is Annette back in there?
Annette?
I think so. Sorry about that. I think I'm obviously the satellite link is playing up with where I am. I mean, I think I'm sure that Stella's probably got better information than I have from a parenting point of view. I think I think facts are very important. I think I would always come back to the facts. And I was at Bonnie Greer came to give a talk last weekend in Galway, and she was talking about critical thinking and how important it is for young people to learn critical thinking, and not just accept things at face value, because I think that would be nobody has full view of any particular area, but I would be saying go back to facts, and that would be an approach that might help a little bit as well.
So the next one here is, either of you can answer this. We are divorced. The mom is against social transition. The dad is pushing for it. What should we do? What are the parents' rights on social transition in the school context in this example? So if one parent, Stella, if the parents are divorced and one parent is saying we need to affirm our daughter, and the mother is saying no.
I think, yeah, this is again common among divorce, just like the sibling thing. It's common, it's complex, and it's really difficult, and it's common as well. I think one thing that the parents can do, I think, would be to meet and say, let's not weaponize this, because this is our kid's deep distress. This is our kid looking for help. And the most important thing we don't do is good cop, bad cop. So, you know, the good cop is the one who basically says, yeah, whatever you want. And the bad cop says, well, no, I urge caution. And as, you know, Annette says, first do no harm. Honestly, though, that'd be a bit idealistic of me, because honestly, it doesn't work, because a lot of divorced parents who disagree on parenting are really in quite significant trouble. So my second tack would be to say, you've got to kind of come in with love first. You know, there's a great phrase we often use in the parent groups, which is heavy on love and heavy on boundaries. And so you really go in with love to the kid, and you just say, I'm just being a cautious parent. That's the worst you have on me. It's the worst. It's the only thing I'm being is cautious. I just want you to go slow. That's all. And you go for kind of building a relationship with the child, but it's really difficult.
That's really good advice there. The next person is saying here, they're from the US. How do we get this gender ideology out of schools? I want to speak a little bit about that. Before the summer, we launched a campaign, and it's sort of like the second head of this whole area, if you like. It's it was when the Department of Education in Ireland was attempting to remove single-sex toilets from schools in Ireland, either retrospectively or for all new bills going forward. And we mobilised and we got advice from a specialist barrister, and we put together templates. And parents used them. They used them in the droves, and it did, it did something, because parents have rights, and this is best done locally. Speaking to your own school, and in that instance, parents use those letters to make their views known at the local school, and also to the Department of Education. And there was a backtrack of sorts, and we were watching this one closely. But the second head of that is the indoctrination of children, which kind of speaks to what we're speaking about tonight, be it online or be it in school via teaching materials. And there's been pledge packs sent out in Ireland to schools in Dublin, and gender identity is introduced now via the national curriculum. But I would say, and I'd be interested to hear what you think, that parents really do have power, and they shouldn't be afraid to make their views known. It's not homophobic, it's not transphobic, that it is their right. They're not being conservative, their instincts are right, and they should be feeling empowered to speak up. What would you say about that, either of you?
Do you want to go first, Annette, there?
Yeah, I think I would be saying that never ignore your instincts. I think from a medical point of view, sometimes, a number of times I've been called by nurses say they've just got a bad feeling about a patient, and they're always right. So I think if there's something that makes you feel uncomfortable, then you should listen to that, because that's something not to ignore.
This is another question for Annette. Stella, if you don't mind. In my work, how do I talk honestly about biology and science? It's a very hostile space. It's everywhere. Only yesterday, someone said to me, there are more than 2 genders. I feel so dishonest not speaking the truth. Thank you. Annette, would you like to answer that?
Sure. I think, definitions are really important in how we talk about everything. The whole rose by any other name. In the end, though, a rose, we know what a rose is, but if you start calling it a daffodil, you're going to get really confused. I think the thing is that, as well, what gender used to mean, which is often a synonym for sex, has completely changed. So I think I would be going back to facts. I would be saying there are, in mammals and many other species, there are only 2 sexes, male and female. And I think then it's also, again, potentially trying to get them to challenge their thinking and say, okay, well, what is gender? What do you mean by gender? And get people to define that, because we know what we mean by sex, and say, well, gender is, there are a multitude of genders. If you talk to some people, they want to go on about multiple different types, but in the end, there are only 2 sexes. And I think, again, I would often say, well, look at it in a different species. A stallion can't become a mare. As we're used to, where people are, not that far from farming, the suggestion that a cock could become a hen would be ridiculous. So those are the sorts of things that I would be saying. Just actually challenge the thinking, and let's tell them to say, well, what do you mean by gender? And then, because actually once you get people to start thinking, well, actually, what do I mean by gender? Then they have to start thinking it through. And I think what you'll find is some people are at different speeds, but a lot of the people that are now gender critical that didn't start off gender critical, a lot of it's because they've actually started to think it through. And once you reach the point where your argument's falling to pieces because, you're going against factual reality.
Thank you. This is for you, Stella. My intelligent daughter socially transitioned without my knowledge or consent to college. Although a tomboy, was not showing any gender dysphoria up until this point. Her internet usage was extreme and still is, and part of her career and job. She had trauma, social outcast, cancer death in the family. Already had an eating disorder, but it's better under control, and she switches off the internet at night. but in no way am I able to control internet usage fully. How do I get her to control this herself? How do I help her critically think her way out of this trans delusion before she gets further entrenched?
You know, it's going to be really hard when the kid is in college. And so, in a way, what will stand to this woman is the raising she's already given her child. I'd love to kind of say, oh, this is the solution. The solution isn't as clear cut as that. When somebody's a young adult, you know, they have freedom to do what they wish. And when their tech use is very heavy, their tech use is very heavy. What I would say is definitely keep meeting the kid, keep on meeting them, keep on questioning them about everything, not just talk about gender. In fact, park gender in a lot of ways. Talk about how echo chambers happen, talk about the fake news phenomenon, talk about how there's a lot of propaganda, there's a lot of people saying, I just look at the science, and they're arguing crazy stuff. And so think critically beyond gender, and then to be able to apply it to gender would be probably the most connecting way to go at this. But it's going to be really, really hard, really difficult.
Would one of you like to give a brief sketch of the appeal in the Keira Bell case? This person is saying, I'm hearing the appellate court reversed the original first decision, but is it not really fully reversed?
Shall I take that, Stella?
Yeah,
I mean, I think certainly. I mean, the issue that they ruled on is Gillick competence, so-called Gillick competence. I think anybody was, I mean, it's about 30 years old now at least. Victoria Gillick went to court about whether or not her underage daughters to give consent to having the pill. And the judgment was that, you know, they could if they were properly counselled. And it's back to against the informed consent, really. So the pure thing on the appeal was this thing about Gillick competence, but it's back really to the original thing I was saying about the fact that everybody is entitled to informed consent. And the problem I see for what's happened with Keira Bell, and has happened with lots of other young women who that obviously Stella looks after with detransitioning, is that they could not possibly have given informed consent because they didn't have the information given to them, because the information doesn't exist in a robust way. So I think the thing is that every time a doctor prescribes a drug outside of its license, we are supposed to make it very clear why we're doing that and document the reasons. And sometimes it's very straightforward. There's some drugs that are very similar from my field, for instance, that we knew were probably going to work well in kidney disease, which has turned out to be the case, but they didn't have that license initially. But something like this, they should be documenting exactly what the fact there is so much uncertainty, so much that isn't known. So I think it really is a legal nicety about Gillick. It's much more beyond that. I mean, the informed consent, she couldn't have given informed consent because they couldn't have given her the information because it isn't there.
And just as a little add-on, I mean, our understanding is that Keira Bell is going to appeal to the Supreme Court.
Yes.
And you know, on the ground, those services are paused as the NHS awaits the results of the CAS review, which is a systemic review. So it's not like the medical legal landscape has gone back to pre-Keira Bell fully.
Absolutely.
Could I make a point there? It's very important that people are aware of the last sentence of the Keira Bell summary judgment, and you can look it up very easily. And the last sentence says, basically, we're in a legal vacuum because the law can't legislate on clinicians' work. However, as the last sentence says, clinicians need to be alive to the fact that they could be sued.
Yeah.
And so suddenly it's basically put it on to the kind of responsibility of the clinicians that there will be lawsuits, and there will be lawsuits. And so that is a really kind of, it's a really important sentence in that ruling where they're saying there's a vacuum here. There it is. Somebody's put it up in the chat. Angus actually has. And you know, you've got to be aware that if you're a clinician working in this world, you have been told in Ireland and in England, because we've been working with the Kirabel, we've been working with the Tavistock, that you are suddenly very, very open to being sued if you work with pediatric transition?
I think that's all we have time for. We've answered a good few there. We're nearly at 9:30. Thank you both. I think if we wanted, we really hope that everyone enjoyed tonight's webinar. And if we had one takeaway, it would be for parents to feel empowered. As I said earlier, you're not being conservative or homophobic or transphobic if you challenge this orthodoxy. And we would like you to feel empowered to do so after tonight's offering. You know, your instincts are correct. Adults do know best most of the time when it comes to the safeguarding of children. And we shouldn't be afraid to be compassionate but firm. And in Abigail Schreier's book, she words it so beautifully. She talks about, you know, it's when the adolescent is in free fall, it's in the parental firmness that they find the handrail. And I think that's what we have to remember. We shouldn't be afraid of being firm, but loving, and they will find that handrail. If you enjoyed our webinar tonight, there is a lot more content on our Countess Conversations YouTube channel, and we look forward to seeing you again. And please look at all the rest of our work on our website. And before I go, I just wanted to let you know that we are releasing a free booklet, which is fully referenced, and Stella, your different groups are there in the reference list of references. It's 20 pages long. It was written by a specialist barrister, a psychologist, with some input and oversight from me. So we hope that is useful and helps to address the sort of vacuum of legally and clinically sound information in this space. But at the moment, it's just gone 9:30, so I'm going to say goodbye, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and hopefully see you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Leisha.